At 34 years old, Eleanor Whitlock stood on the edge of the cold Atlantic coast with only $6 sewn into the hem of her worn traveling skirt after her uncle Silas cast her out of the family farmhouse, declaring that a woman without a husband had no rightful claim to the land she had helped keep alive for nearly 20 years, and before the sun had finished sinking beyond the grey horizon, she spent 5 of those precious dollars on an abandoned lighthouse overlooking the forgotten harbour of Blackwater Point, a purchase so foolish that nearly every soul in the town laughed openly as she accepted the rusted iron key, never imagining that something long sealed inside the lantern room had waited through storms, wars, and lonely winters for someone exactly like her, something that would not only change the course of her own life, but quietly breathe hope back into a community that had forgotten how to believe in tomorrow. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Whitlock. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us its name in the comments, because every place deserves to have its story remembered. Eleanor had never believed that a person's worth could be measured by the weight of the purse they carried, or by the size of the roof over their head. Those were ideas that belonged to people who had forgotten how quickly fortunes could disappear with a failed harvest, a cruel winter, or a single dishonest signature on a legal paper. She had been taught something quieter, something stronger, by her father, Nathan Whitlock, who repaired fishing boats along the rocky Massachusetts coast before his hands became too stiff with age to hold a hammer as steadily as he once had. Nathan used to say that wood always remembered the shape it was meant to have. Even a weather-beaten beam could carry a home for another generation if someone patient enough understood where to reinforce it instead of throwing it away. Eleanor remembered those words better than she remembered the sound of church bells or the speeches of traveling politicians. They had become part of the rhythm of her thinking, as dependable as the tide itself. Her mother, Abigail, possessed gentleness without weakness. Every evening she lit a small oil lamp before darkness settled across the harbour, insisting that a warm light in the window might comfort a traveller who had never even seen their home before. As a child, Eleanor often asked whether strangers truly noticed such a tiny flame against the vastness of the night. Abigail would smile without lifting her eyes from the needlework in her lap, and answer that hope never needed to be large to be seen. It only needed to remain lit. That sentence followed Eleanor throughout her life more faithfully than any possession she ever owned. The Whitlock cottage overlooked fishing docks where gulls argued from sunrise until dusk. Salt rested on every windowsill, and the wind carried stories from ships arriving with cargoes of timber, wool, and spices gathered from places Eleanor could scarcely imagine. While other children chased one another through dusty lanes, Eleanor preferred wandering beside the shoreline, collecting pieces of driftwood polished smooth by years beneath the waves. She examined each fragment carefully before carrying it home, because her father insisted every piece had once belonged somewhere important. A broken mast, a forgotten crate, the side of a rowboat, even the splinter from an old pier. All had histories hidden beneath their worn surfaces. She learned to sand rough edges until the grain beneath began shining once more. She learned how brass surrendered its dullness under patient hands. She learned to oil rusted hinges instead of replacing them. Most importantly, she learned that restoration demanded attention before strength. One could not save anything without first understanding what it had endured. The neighbors often joked that Eleanor spoke more comfortably to old buildings than to crowded rooms of people. There was truth hidden beneath their laughter. She found silence easier than conversation, because silence allowed forgotten things to reveal themselves. Cracked walls whispered through shifting timbers. Floors announced loose boards beneath careful footsteps. Old windows carried scratches left by hands long gone. Every abandoned place seemed eager to tell its story if someone cared enough to listen. Blackwater Point itself possessed countless stories that few people bothered remembering anymore. Older fishermen still spoke of years when the harbour bustled with merchant vessels waiting their turn to unload beneath towering cranes. They remembered festivals where children filled the streets carrying paper lanterns, while musicians played until midnight beneath strings of glowing lights. But prosperity had drifted elsewhere, as larger ports claimed more trade. Families moved inland searching for factory work. Shops closed one by one, until empty windows reflected only sea mist and lonely afternoons. The lighthouse stood above all of it, watching without complaint. Its white paint had surrendered long ago to grey weather stains. Several windows were boarded. Ivy climbed stubbornly around the lower stonework. The iron railings circling the lantern room wore thick patches of orange rust. To newcomers, it looked like another forgotten structure, waiting patiently for collapse. Yet older sailors still glanced toward it by habit whenever storms rolled across the water, remembering evenings when its brilliant beacon cut through impossible darkness and guided exhausted crews safely home. Eleanor noticed those glances. She noticed that memory still lived inside people even after hope had nearly vanished. And although she had never stepped inside the abandoned tower, she often found herself wondering whether buildings, like people, ever grew lonely after serving their purpose. As Eleanor grew older, the quiet habits that had once made other children tease her slowly became the qualities that older neighbors admired. Whenever a widow discovered a broken chair that seemed beyond repair, it was Eleanor who carried it home, instead of letting it become firewood. When shutters hung crooked after a spring storm, she climbed the ladder without complaint. If an elderly fisherman returned from the docks with a cracked sea chest whose lid no longer closed, he would often leave it outside the Whitlock cottage, knowing that within a week, Eleanor would return it, looking as though it had years of faithful service still ahead. She never considered herself especially talented. She simply believed that time, patience, and careful hands could rescue almost anything that had not completely surrendered to neglect. Her father smiled each time another restored object left their workshop, because he understood that his daughter was not merely repairing wood or iron. She was preserving memories that would otherwise disappear without anyone noticing. Those lessons shaped the woman she became far more than any formal education could have managed. She learned to judge people by their actions instead of their appearance, to measure wealth by usefulness instead of ownership, and to believe that forgotten places often carried the greatest stories. Travelers occasionally stopped in Blackwater Point on their journey farther north, bringing newspapers filled with tales of booming cities, towering factories, and fortunes made almost overnight. The younger people in town read those pages with restless excitement, dreaming of crowded streets, lit by electric lamps, and opportunities beyond the reach of the sea. Eleanor read them too, but her attention always drifted back toward the older columns describing weathered villages, historic buildings, and communities struggling to survive. She wondered why everyone seemed eager to build something new while abandoning things that had served faithfully for generations. It seemed to her that gratitude had become rarer than prosperity. On clear evenings, she often climbed the cliffs overlooking the harbor, carrying nothing more than a blanket and a small notebook. From there, she could see the lighthouse standing alone against the endless Atlantic, its dark lantern room reflecting the last colors of sunset. Long before it fell silent, that beacon had been the first welcome sailors saw after weeks on uncertain waters. Even after its light had gone out, the tower remained standing, refusing to surrender to salt, wind, or time. Eleanor felt strangely comforted by that stubbornness. She imagined the countless keepers who had climbed its spiral stairs through winter gales, trimmed the great lamp, polished the enormous glass lenses, and watched over strangers they would never meet. Such work demanded faith. The keeper lit the lamp each evening, without knowing whose life might depend upon it before dawn. There was something deeply beautiful about serving people who would never know your name. One autumn afternoon, she met old Captain Horace Bell sitting alone beside the abandoned pier, with a coil of worn rope resting across his knees. His sailing days had ended years earlier, after an injury left one leg stiff, but his eyes still carried the distant look of a man who measured time by tides instead of calendars. Eleanor sat beside him without speaking until he finally nodded toward the lighthouse. "Most folks only see broken stone," he murmured. "Sailors see promises." She turned toward the lonely tower, letting the wind carry the silence between them, before asking what he meant. The old captain smiled faintly. When that light burned, every man out there believed someone ashore expected him to come home. Never underestimate what a single light can tell a tired soul. Those words settled quietly into Eleanor's heart. She wrote them carefully inside her notebook that evening, adding beneath them a single sentence of her own. Perhaps forgotten places are only waiting for someone willing to remember why they mattered. Years passed gently, marked by changing seasons rather than dramatic events. Spring brought fishing boats painted with fresh colors. Summer filled the shoreline with children collecting shells. Autumn carried sharp winds scented with pine from the inland forests, while winter wrapped the harbor in grey skies that seemed to blend sea and clouds into one endless horizon. Through every season, Eleanor remained much the same, steady, dependable, and content with simple work. Yet beneath that calm lived a quiet dream she shared with no one. Someday, if fortune ever allowed, she hoped to restore a building everyone else had abandoned. Not for profit, nor for recognition, but because she believed every community deserved at least one person willing to protect its memories before they vanished forever. She could never have imagined that life would soon strip away everything familiar, leaving her with nothing except that dream and the values patiently planted by her parents many years before. Nor could she have guessed that the forgotten lighthouse watching over Blackwater Point had, in its own silent way, been waiting for her all along. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of sea mist that blurred the line between the cliffs and the restless Atlantic. Eleanor had slept little, wrapped in an old wool blanket beneath the shelter of a weathered fishing shed after leaving the last place she had ever called home. The wind had found every opening in the rough timber walls, yet she felt strangely calm. Once a person had lost nearly everything, there remained very little left to fear except surrender itself. As the first pale light stretched across Blackwater Point, she untied the careful stitches hidden inside the hem of her skirt and counted the coins one final time. $6. They represented every remaining certainty in her life. 5 silver dollars and 4 quarters, polished smooth by years of passing from one hard-working hand to another. She held them in her palm for several moments before closing her fingers around them again. Her father had often said that money was meant to be used with wisdom rather than protected by fear. Standing there beside the cold sea, she realized wisdom sometimes looked remarkably similar to desperation. The abandoned lighthouse rose above the harbor exactly as it always had, its weather-stained stone catching the first faint glow of sunrise. From a distance, it appeared lonely rather than ruined. The tower had outlived generations of sailors, storms, and seasons, yet no lamp had burned within its lantern room for nearly 15 years. Grass grew between broken flagstones, leading toward its heavy oak door. Seabirds nested comfortably beneath cracked roof tiles on the keeper's cottage nearby. Nature had begun reclaiming the place, one quiet season at a time. Eleanor climbed the winding path with slow, deliberate steps, noticing details that others overlooked. The foundation stones remained remarkably solid, despite decades of harsh weather. Rainwater drained properly along the hillside. The iron railing surrounding the lantern gallery showed rust, but no dangerous warping. Even the old keeper's cottage, though neglected, leaned less than many occupied homes in town. Whoever had built the lighthouse had expected it to withstand generations. That expectation still lingered inside every stone. At the harbor office, where unused properties occasionally changed hands, a handful of fishermen stood warming themselves around a cast-iron stove. Conversation stopped almost immediately as Eleanor entered. Several recognized her from the previous day's eviction. Their expressions carried sympathy mixed with uncomfortable curiosity. They wondered where she had spent the night, but were too polite to ask. Behind the worn wooden counter sat Harold Finch, the town clerk, a careful man whose spectacles rested permanently near the end of his nose. He looked surprised to see Eleanor so early. "Miss Whitlock," he said gently, "is there something I can help you with?" She removed 5 silver dollars from her pocket and placed them carefully upon the counter. The coins made a soft metallic sound that drew every eye in the room. "I've come to purchase the abandoned lighthouse at Blackwater Point." Silence settled over the office. Then someone laughed. Another fisherman shook his head, as though convinced he had misheard. Harold removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly with a folded handkerchief, and looked at Eleanor once more. "You understand," he began carefully, "that the structure has been condemned for public use. Condemned doesn't always mean beyond saving." Another chuckle spread through the room. "It leaks," one man muttered. "The stairs aren't safe," another added. "No one's lived there since old Keeper Alden died. Ghosts probably own it now," someone joked from the back of the room, drawing louder laughter. Eleanor remained perfectly still until the laughter faded on its own. "Is it for sale?" she asked quietly. Harold opened a ledger thick with faded property records. His finger traced several entries before stopping. "Technically, yes. The town council voted years ago that anyone willing to accept full responsibility for maintenance could purchase the property for $5. Nobody ever showed the slightest interest. Then I'd like to buy it. Harold studied her face, searching perhaps for uncertainty or regret. He found neither. With a slow sigh, he dipped his pen into an ink bottle and began preparing the transfer papers. As he wrote, he spoke almost apologetically. The beacon machinery no longer works. Most of the windows need replacing. The keeper's cottage roof leaks. Salt has reached nearly every iron fitting. You'll receive no financial assistance from the town. Eleanor nodded. I understand. There is no fresh water on the property. I'll manage. People think you're making a terrible mistake. For the first time that morning, a faint smile appeared across Eleanor's face. People have mistaken neglect for worthlessness before. Harold paused, then smiled almost imperceptibly himself. A few minutes later, he handed her a folded deed, an old brass key blackened with age, and a receipt acknowledging payment of exactly $5. Well, he said softly, I suppose Blackwater Point has a lighthouse keeper again. The words lingered in the room long after Eleanor stepped outside. Several townspeople watched from storefronts as she climbed back toward the cliffs, carrying nothing except her small trunk, her father's tools, and the ancient key swinging gently from one hand. Children pointed toward her. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men leaning against the dock exchanged amused glances. News traveled quickly through small coastal towns. Before noon, nearly everyone knew that the woman who had lost her home had somehow decided to spend almost every remaining coin buying the oldest abandoned building in the county. Poor thing's lost her senses, one merchant remarked. Grief does strange things. She'll be back within a week asking for work. That tower will collapse before winter. Eleanor heard fragments of those conversations, drifting upward with the wind, but she never once looked back. The heavy oak door resisted at first. Rust had nearly frozen its hinges in place. She inserted the old brass key, pressed her shoulder firmly against the weathered timber, and with a deep groan that echoed through the empty tower, the lighthouse welcomed its first visitor in many years. The air inside carried the unmistakable scent of salt, damp stone, ancient wood, and forgotten years. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of sunlight slipping between boarded windows. Her footsteps echoed softly against the circular walls as she stepped across the worn threshold. Nothing greeted her except silence. Yet it was not an empty silence. It felt patient, respectful, as though the building itself had been waiting without complaint for someone to return. Eleanor closed the door behind her and stood still, allowing her eyes to adjust. She rested one hand against the cool stone wall. Well, she whispered with gentle warmth, let's see what we've both survived. The lower rooms contained exactly what she expected. Broken furniture lay beneath layers of dust. Shelves sagged beneath forgotten tools. A cracked oil can rested beside an iron stove whose chimney had long since filled with nests. Rain had stained portions of the ceiling, but the supporting beams remained remarkably sound. She smiled quietly. The bones of the building were healthy. It had simply been neglected. Hour after hour she worked without hurry. She swept decades of dust from the entrance hall. She opened warped shutters to admit fresh sea air. She carried broken boards outside into neat piles for later repair. Every task reminded her of afternoons spent beside her father, restoring abandoned workshops and weathered cottages. By sunset, the lighthouse already seemed lighter somehow, as though grateful simply to breathe again. At last, she began climbing the narrow spiral staircase toward the lantern room. Each iron step creaked beneath her careful weight, but none failed. The higher she climbed, the stronger the wind became, whispering softly through cracked window panes. When she finally reached the great lantern chamber at the very top of the tower, Eleanor stopped in quiet amazement. Although covered in years of dust, the enormous circular glass lenses still caught the fading sunlight, scattering faint rainbows across the stone floor. The great bronze lamp stood silent at the center, like an aging guardian waiting for one final night of duty. She slowly circled the room, admiring the remarkable craftsmanship. Then something unusual caught her attention. Near the western side of the lantern room, beneath one section of the wooden floor, she noticed a narrow strip where the dust had settled differently. The boards there appeared slightly newer than those surrounding them. She knelt, brushing away decades of fine gray dust with her fingertips. Tiny scratches surrounded several old brass screws, almost invisible beneath the grime. Someone had removed those boards once before and carefully fastened them back into place. Eleanor rested her father's small screwdriver against the first rusted screw. She did not yet know what lay beneath that section of flooring, only that someone many years earlier had wanted it hidden well enough that the secret would survive long after they were gone. Eleanor did not remove the boards immediately. Every lesson her father had ever taught her urged patience before curiosity. Hidden things often remained hidden for reasons that deserved understanding before they were disturbed. Instead, she marked the unusual section of floor by placing her worn canvas satchel beside it, then spent the remaining daylight examining every corner of the lantern room. The enormous Fresnel lens, though coated with years of salt and dust, remained astonishingly intact. She had never seen such craftsmanship up close. Hundreds of precisely cut glass prisms surrounded the great bronze lamp, each one designed to gather the smallest flame and carry it across miles of dark ocean. She gently passed a cloth across one section, revealing crystal so clear that it caught the setting sun and scattered warm bands of amber and gold across the stone walls. For a brief moment, the abandoned room seemed alive again, as though remembering evenings when ships far beyond the horizon had trusted that light with their lives. She smiled quietly. "Someone built this to last," she whispered. "They expected another pair of careful hands someday." The words echoed softly around the circular chamber, before disappearing into the steady sound of waves below. Night approached quickly. Eleanor carried an old lantern she had found downstairs onto the narrow gallery surrounding the lantern room. The sea stretched endlessly beneath a sky, slowly filling with stars. Blackwater Point looked very different from above. The houses appeared smaller, the harbor looked gentler. The people who had laughed that morning were invisible from this height. She realized that distance often softened pain. What had seemed unbearable only hours earlier already felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of something she could not yet understand. The following morning, she rose before sunrise and resumed cleaning. She scrubbed windows that had not admitted proper daylight in years. She repaired loose hinges, swept staircases, and opened long-sealed cupboards. By afternoon, the tower smelled less of abandonment and more of fresh sea air, mixed with old pine and lamp oil. Every improvement encouraged her. The lighthouse had not been dying. It had simply been waiting. Near midday, Captain Horace Bell slowly climbed the winding path, carrying a small basket beneath one arm. "Thought a lighthouse keeper ought to have breakfast," he called with a smile, before reaching the door. Inside the basket rested fresh bread, smoked cod, apples, and a small jar of blackberry preserves. Eleanor thanked him warmly. "I wish I had something to offer in return." Horace looked around the brightened entrance hall with quiet amazement. "You've already given this old place something nobody else has managed for 15 years. What's that?" "Hope." They shared a simple meal outside overlooking the harbor. Horace studied the tower thoughtfully before speaking again. "There was a man named Samuel Mercer who kept this lighthouse longer than anyone else. 40 years nearly. Never missed a single lighting." Eleanor listened carefully. "Did you know him well?" "As well as any sailor knew the man who brought him safely home." Horace smiled at the memory. Samuel wasn't a man of many words, preferred journals to conversations. Eleanor paused. Journals. Every keeper kept records. Weather, ship movements, storms, repairs. But Samuel, the old captain hesitated. Samuel wrote much more than duty required. Folks used to joke he could fill an entire library before he filled a conversation. What became of his writings? Horace slowly shook his head. Nobody knows. After he passed, town officials cleared the building. They claimed everything important had already been removed. Eleanor's thoughts drifted immediately toward the unusual floorboards in the lantern room. Though she said nothing, Horace eventually departed, leaving behind not only food, but another piece of the lighthouse's forgotten history. That evening, Eleanor climbed once again to the lantern room, carrying her father's tools. The wind outside rose steadily, rattling loose panes as clouds gathered over the Atlantic. She knelt beside the suspicious section of flooring and carefully fitted the screwdriver into the first weathered brass screw. It resisted at first, then slowly surrendered with a faint metallic groan. One by one, she removed the remaining screws, placing each carefully into her apron pocket. The final board remained stubborn. Years of salt air had sealed it tightly into place. Using a thin pry bar from Nathan's tool chest, she gently lifted one edge until the board finally loosened with a deep wooden sigh. Beneath it lay not treasure, nor gold, nor hidden weapons, as the children's ghost stories had imagined. Instead, she discovered a narrow cedar compartment built expertly between the supporting beams. Resting inside was a rectangular wooden box wrapped in faded oilcloth. The wrapping had become brittle with age, but had protected its contents remarkably well. Eleanor lifted the box with both hands. It felt surprisingly heavy. Dust covered every surface except a small brass plate fastened to the lid. She carefully wiped it clean. 3 words appeared in elegant engraved lettering: "For whoever returns." Her heartbeat quickened. Whoever had hidden this box had expected someone, not a specific person, but someone, to find it eventually. The message had not been addressed to family or officials. It had been left for a stranger willing to care enough to look. Eleanor carried the box downstairs before opening it, unwilling to risk dropping anything valuable on the narrow spiral staircase. She placed it upon an old wooden table inside the keeper's cottage, where evening light streamed through a newly cleaned window. The brass latch opened easily despite its age. Inside rested a thick, leather-bound diary, several folded maps, a small iron key attached to blue ribbon, faded almost grey, and dozens of neatly tied letters bundled with waxed cord. The diary lay uppermost. Its cover showed years of careful use. Opening the first page, Eleanor immediately recognized steady, disciplined handwriting. October 3rd, 1871. If these pages are ever read by another keeper, then the light has outlived me, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. A lighthouse is never meant to belong to one person. It belongs to every soul searching for home. Eleanor slowly turned another page. The entries described storms, repairs, ships rescued from hidden reefs, and quiet observations about lonely nights watching over the sea. Samuel Mercer possessed remarkable kindness, even on paper. He recorded the names of sailors lost in storms so they would not be forgotten. He wrote about children waving from the harbor each evening when the beacon first appeared. He described widows leaving flowers beside the tower after husbands returned safely because the light had guided them through dangerous waters. The lighthouse had been far more than a building. It had been the heart of Blackwater Point. Then, many pages later, the tone changed. Samuel began writing about meetings with powerful businessmen from Boston who wanted to redirect shipping toward a newly constructed commercial harbor farther south. They believed Blackwater Point had become unnecessary. Several investors planned to influence county officials into closing the lighthouse permanently, despite objections from local sailors. Samuel recorded names, dates, conversations, and troubling details with remarkable precision. Eleanor read faster. One particular entry made her stop completely. "They offered me money today, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my years, if I would remain silent while they falsified reports claiming this lighthouse no longer served enough vessels to justify its operation. I refused. Some lights exist because profit cannot measure their worth." Eleanor looked toward the silent tower rising beyond the cottage window. Suddenly, the abandonment of the lighthouse seemed far less ordinary than everyone believed. Samuel had known something important, something valuable enough to hide beneath the lantern room floor instead of trusting public records. She carefully untied the bundle of letters. Most were copies Samuel himself had written to government officials, harbor authorities, newspaper editors, and shipping inspectors, warning them about corruption surrounding the proposed closure. Several replies acknowledged receiving his concerns, but promised only future investigations that apparently never happened. Near the bottom of the box rested one final envelope unlike the others. Its paper remained sealed with dark red wax bearing Samuel Mercer's initials. Across the front, in the same careful handwriting, appeared another message: "Do not open unless the lighthouse has been left dark." Eleanor stared at the unopened letter for several long moments. Outside, waves crashed steadily against the cliffs, exactly as they had for generations. Inside the quiet cottage, surrounded by forgotten truths preserved through patience rather than chance, she slowly reached toward the unbroken seal, sensing that whatever Samuel Mercer had entrusted to the future was about to reveal not only why the lighthouse had been abandoned, but why someone had worked so carefully to ensure its story was never completely erased. Eleanor held the sealed envelope beneath the warm glow of her lantern for several minutes, before finally breaking the dark red wax. She did not rush because she understood that once certain truths entered the world, they could never again be hidden. The brittle paper unfolded with surprising ease despite the passing years. Samuel Mercer's handwriting appeared as steady on the final letter as it had in the diary, every sentence carefully formed, as though he knew generations might someday depend upon his words. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then the light has gone dark, and I have failed to protect it. That failure belongs to me alone, but the future belongs to whoever has chosen to climb these stairs after everyone else stopped believing this place mattered. Before you judge this town too harshly, remember that fear often convinces decent people to remain silent, while dishonest people speak loudly. Blackwater Point did not lose its lighthouse because the sea no longer needed it. It lost its lighthouse because powerful men discovered they could profit from darkness." Eleanor slowly lowered the page. The room seemed quieter than before. Even the wind outside appeared to have softened, as though listening alongside her. She continued reading. Samuel described secret meetings held nearly 20 years earlier inside the office of the County Shipping Authority. Investors from larger ports had argued that maintaining Blackwater Point's lighthouse diverted valuable shipping traffic away from newly constructed commercial docks farther south. Insurance companies, warehouse owners, and freight agents all stood to earn substantial fortunes if vessels bypassed the old harbor. Closing the lighthouse would gradually force captains to choose different routes, weakening the local fishing economy until Blackwater Point became too poor to compete. Samuel had refused to support the plan. When officials requested his signature on inspection reports, falsely claiming the lighthouse machinery had become permanently unsafe, he declined. Weeks later, county engineers suddenly declared the tower too expensive to maintain. Funding disappeared almost overnight. Newspapers printed short notices announcing the closure, and within months, the beacon that had guided sailors for decades fell dark. Yet Samuel's letter revealed something even more troubling. He had quietly gathered copies of shipping records, maintenance receipts, correspondence, and financial ledgers proving the lighthouse had been fully repairable when officials ordered its closure. He had hidden everything because he feared the evidence would be destroyed before an honest investigation could begin. Truth sometimes survives only because someone is willing to hide it until another generation is brave enough to reveal it, he wrote. Eleanor looked toward the remaining contents of the cedar box. The folded maps suddenly seemed far more significant than she had first imagined. She carefully spread the largest one across the old wooden table. It was a remarkably detailed chart of the coastline surrounding Blackwater Point. Tiny handwritten markings appeared in the margins beside familiar coves, reefs, and anchorages. Most seemed ordinary until she noticed a series of small circles drawn around an inlet just north of the lighthouse. Beside the circles, Samuel had written a brief note. Original emergency harbor, deep enough for rescue vessels during severe storms, deliberately removed from revised navigation charts after closure order. Eleanor frowned. She compared the old chart with a newer county map hanging inside the cottage. The sheltered inlet Samuel had marked did not appear on the modern version at all. Someone had erased it from official records. That discovery unsettled her even more than the letter itself. Removing a safe harbor from navigation charts endangered every unfamiliar captain sailing the coastline. Samuel had not merely documented corruption. He had documented decisions that placed lives at risk. She spent the next several hours examining every document inside the box. The bundled letters included receipts showing regular maintenance of the lighthouse machinery right up until the year officials claimed the tower had become impossible to repair. There were signed delivery records for replacement lenses, invoices for fresh lamp oil, engineering reports praising the strength of the stone foundation, and careful diagrams of improvements Samuel himself had completed over the years. None of it matched the public story repeated throughout Blackwater Point for nearly 2 decades. According to every official document preserved inside the cedar compartment, the lighthouse had been abandoned, not because it failed, but because someone wanted it forgotten. The following morning, Eleanor carried only the diary to the harbor. She deliberately left the remaining evidence hidden beneath a loose floorboard inside the keeper's cottage. Trust, she reminded herself, should be earned one careful step at a time. Captain Horace Bell sat repairing an old fishing net beside the dock when he noticed her approaching. "You found something," he said, before she spoke a single word. Eleanor looked at him with quiet surprise. "How did you know?" The old sailor smiled. "Your eyes aren't carrying yesterday anymore." She handed him Samuel Mercer's diary. Horace adjusted his spectacles and slowly read several pages in silence. As he turned each page, his expression changed from curiosity to disbelief, and finally to quiet sorrow. "Mercer tried to tell us," he whispered. "I remember now. Folks thought he had become stubborn in his old age. They said he refused to accept progress." He closed the diary gently. "Progress," he repeated bitterly. "Sometimes that's the finest word greed ever borrowed." "Did anyone believe him?" Eleanor asked. Horace stared across the harbor toward the silent lighthouse. Some did. Most were too frightened to challenge men with money and influence. Before either could continue, a familiar voice interrupted them. Reading old ghost stories. Silas Whitlock stood several yards away outside the general store, watching them with folded arms. His smile carried the same practiced confidence Eleanor remembered from the day he claimed her family home. "I hear the lighthouse has already filled your head with legends." Eleanor calmly met his gaze. "Old buildings remember more than people think." Silas laughed softly. "Buildings don't remember anything. Only fools waste time listening to stones." Without another word, he entered the store, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. Horace watched him disappear. "Your uncle has been asking questions around town," he said quietly. "Questions about what? About whether you found anything valuable inside the lighthouse." Eleanor felt a slight chill despite the morning sun. She had told no one except Horace about Samuel's diary. Yet somehow, Silas already suspected the abandoned tower might contain more than broken furniture and dust. That evening, after returning to the lighthouse, Eleanor climbed once more to the lantern room. Sunset painted the Atlantic with long ribbons of gold and crimson. She carefully polished another section of the great Fresnel lens until it sparkled like newly cut crystal. Standing beside the silent beacon, she imagined Samuel Mercer performing the same quiet task decades earlier, believing every clean pane of glass might someday save a stranger's life. She understood him now. Restoration had never been about objects alone. It had always been about responsibility. As darkness settled across the coast, she noticed something unusual below. A lone figure stood near the base of the lighthouse path, partially hidden behind windswept pines. The person remained motionless for several moments, apparently studying the tower. Then, after glancing toward the harbor to ensure no one else was nearby, the stranger quietly disappeared into the gathering darkness. Eleanor remained perfectly still beside the lantern room window. Whoever had climbed that far had not come to admire the view. Someone else knew or suspected that the abandoned lighthouse was no longer keeping only memories, and for the first time since purchasing the forgotten tower for $5, Eleanor realized that Samuel Mercer's secret had survived the years for one simple reason. There were still people who would rather the truth remained buried forever.